There are certain photographs that do more than simply capture a moment in time. They capture something far more unsettling, something that whispers of events the official narrative would rather we never questioned. Scattered across archives around the world, mostly dated somewhere between the 1840s and 1860s, though we should probably take those dates with more than a grain of salt, there exists a collection of images that share one impossible characteristic. They show us cities of breathtaking grandeur, streets perfectly laid out, architecture that speaks of sophistication and wealth, but every single one of them is utterly, completely, hauntingly empty. These are not photographs of early mornings or quiet afternoons. These are images of total absence. No people walking the boulevards, no carriages rattling over cobblestones, not even a dog wandering the streets or a bird perched on a rooftop. The silence in these images is so profound you can almost hear it through the photograph itself. As you examine them more closely, you start to notice other details. The windows of these magnificent buildings gape open, many without glass, as if they have been standing vacant for years. These are not cities waiting for their inhabitants to wake up. These are cities that have been abandoned, left behind after something terrible happened. And here's where it gets strange. In the 19th century, city life didn't happen indoors. It happened on the streets. Markets would fill the squares. Merchants would set up their stalls before dawn and stay until dusk. Horses would be tied to posts for hours while their owners conducted business. There would be barrels stacked against walls, firewood piled high for the coming winter, sacks of grain waiting to be moved. And yet in these photographs, there is nothing. The streets are pristine, almost sterile. No laundry hanging between buildings, no signs of commerce or daily life, just empty stone and silent facades. Look at the rooftops and you'll see chimneys, dozens of them, hundreds even. But from not a single one does smoke rise into the sky. No warmth in those houses, no fires burning for cooking or heating, no life whatsoever. The trees, when they appear at all, are impossibly young, thin saplings that look like they were planted just months before the photograph was taken. Where are the mature trees you would expect to see in historic European capitals? Where are the ancient parks and tree-lined avenues we know existed? Everything suggests something recently cleared, recently abandoned, recently begun again. Of course, there's an explanation that immediately comes to mind, one that seems to solve the whole puzzle quite neatly. Early photography required extremely long exposures, sometimes 10 minutes or more. Anything that moved during that time, a person walking, a horse trotting, a bird in flight, would simply fail to register on the photographic plate. The technology could only capture what remained, perfectly still. It's a convenient answer. It turns a profound mystery into nothing more than a technical limitation of primitive cameras. Case closed. But what if that explanation doesn't actually explain anything at all? What if, when you look closer at the facts, that neat little theory falls apart completely? Because there's something we need to examine before we start talking about lost civilizations or global catastrophes. We need to understand whether this technical explanation actually holds up under scrutiny. And I can tell you right now, it absolutely does not. The theory about long exposures sounds perfectly reasonable until you start looking at other photographs from the exact same time period. Take the photograph of Abraham Lincoln's inauguration in 1861. In that image, you can clearly see thousands upon thousands of people gathered in front of the Capitol. Individual figures are visible. You can make out groups, hats, the shapes of the crowd. Some figures might be slightly blurred, but they are undeniably there. The photograph captured them. And this is not some unique exception. There are numerous other images from the 1850s and 60s showing city scenes with people, with carriages, with life. If photographers could capture massive crowds at presidential inaugurations, why did the same photographers, using similar equipment, produce completely lifeless images when they turned their cameras toward the grand squares of major capitals? It makes no sense to suggest they deliberately used worse equipment for some photographs while reserving better technology for others. But let's say, just for the sake of argument, that we accept the idea of a 10-minute exposure. Moving objects disappear. Fine. But what about everything that wasn't moving? City life in the 19th century was not just about people rushing from place to place. Think about it. Carts would be parked outside warehouses for hours while goods were unloaded. Market stalls, once set up in the morning, would remain in exactly the same spot until evening. Horses tied to posts would stand there patiently, sometimes for most of the day. Barrels of goods, crates of merchandise, stacks of building materials. All of these things would have been completely stationary. Any camera, no matter how primitive, should have captured them with perfect clarity. Yet, they are nowhere to be seen. The streets are not just empty of people, they are empty of everything. No traces of human activity whatsoever. No camera exposure time can explain that. And then there's a technical detail that destroys the entire theory. In several of these mysterious photographs, you can see fountains. And here's what's remarkable. The water jets are actually captured in the images. They appear as blurry, milky, ghostly streams, which is exactly what you would expect from a long exposure photograph of moving water. The camera recorded the general shape and position of the water over the course of several minutes. Now think about what that means. If the photographic technology was capable of capturing constantly moving water, it should have, with absolute certainty, captured smoke rising from chimneys. Smoke moves slowly, it drifts upward, changes shape, exactly like a fountain's spray. A long exposure photograph should show smoke as the same kind of blurry, ghostly presence in the sky. But there is no smoke anywhere, not a single wisp, not a hint of it. The only logical conclusion is that the chimneys were cold, the fires were out, the houses were empty. The technical explanation has failed us. What we are left with is the unavoidable truth. These streets really were empty. The cities really were abandoned. And now the question transforms from how could a camera capture this to what in the world happened here? Once we dismiss the comfortable story about camera limitations, we have to confront what these photographs are actually showing us. And when you look at them with fresh eyes, accepting that they depict reality rather than technical error, you start to see signs of something else. Not just emptiness, but aftermath. These images don't show sleeping cities. They show cities that have been through something catastrophic and are only just beginning to recover. If you compare these photographs to images of cities damaged in wars, say during World War I, you see a striking difference. War-torn cities show chaos. Buildings reduced to rubble, craters in the streets, mountains of debris. But amidst all that destruction, there are always people, soldiers picking through the ruins, refugees trying to salvage what they can, residents attempting to rebuild their lives. The mysterious photographs from the 19th century show something entirely different. There is damage, yes, but of a very particular kind. And more importantly, there is a complete and total absence of anyone who might have witnessed what happened. The closest modern comparison might be somewhere like Pripyat, the city abandoned overnight after Chernobyl. But even Pripyat, frozen in time, is filled with traces of human presence. Furniture left in apartments, books on shelves, children's toys scattered in playgrounds. The dead cities of the 19th century look different. They look cleaned out, washed away. On the streets and in the squares of many of them, you can clearly see deposits of mud and silt and clay. These materials have buried the ground floors of buildings. The cobblestones have disappeared beneath them. In some photographs, you can even see pools of standing water, as if a flood or mud flow had only recently passed through. It appears as though some enormous wave, or perhaps a massive torrent of liquid mud, surged through these streets, carrying away everything in its path. People, animals, carts, market goods, everything that made up the living fabric of urban life. And this flood didn't just sweep things away. It brought something with it, tons and tons of earth and clay that settled over everything, burying the lower levels of the city beneath a thick layer of sediment. The vegetation tells the same story. In cities where you would expect to see ancient trees, centuries-old oaks and elms lining the boulevards, there is either nothing at all or only very young, very thin saplings. They look as if they were planted just months or perhaps a year or two before the photograph was taken, pushed into bare, recently cleared earth. This is completely inconsistent with what we know about historic European capitals and their famous parks and tree-lined streets. It's as if some force destroyed not only the people but all the mature vegetation as well, leaving behind a wasteland that is only now beginning to come back to life. When you put all these elements together, the widespread mud deposits, the traces of water, the abnormally young trees, they form a coherent picture, a recent catastrophe, something involving water or mud on a massive scale. And the photographs showing early cleanup efforts only reinforce this interpretation. In some images, you can make out one or two solitary figures against the backdrop of a vast, empty city. They don't look like residents going about their daily business. They look like workers or engineers who have been sent to assess the damage and begin the process of recovery. They stand before half-buried buildings, and the contrast between their small scale and the magnitude of the architecture, not to mention the thickness of the mud layers, only emphasizes just how enormous this disaster must have been. This was not simply a city that experienced a flood and then moved on. This was an entire world that was buried and is now being slowly, painfully brought back to life. In a situation like that, with civilization effectively reset, you would expect every available resource to be devoted to the most basic necessities: shelter, food, clean water, repairing the roads, getting essential infrastructure back online. Survival would be the only priority that mattered. Yet paradoxically, in this shattered, barely recovering world, something very strange begins to happen. Something that suggests the priorities of those who arrived in these desolate places were very different from what we might expect. In a world that has just survived a global catastrophe, basic logic tells us that every ounce of effort should go toward immediate survival needs. Building temporary housing, securing food supplies, establishing some kind of order and safety. Every brick, every working hand, every bit of available capital should be directed toward bringing life back to the ruined cities. But when we look at the historical record and the photographs from this period, we encounter something baffling. All across the world, against a backdrop of widespread devastation and clear evidence of a recent cataclysm, observatories start appearing, or they are restored. Like mushrooms sprouting after rain, these temples dedicated to watching distant stars somehow become a top priority in an age when it would make far more sense to be watching the ground beneath your feet, not the heavens above. The case of Strasbourg in 1870 perfectly illustrates just how strange this priority is. As a result of the Franco-Prussian War, the city was subjected to brutal bombardment and was essentially leveled. Photographs and records survive showing entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble, not a single building left standing. The humanitarian disaster was obvious and immediate. Thousands of people without shelter, without food, without the most basic necessities. You would think that every available resource would be thrown into rebuilding homes, restoring essential services, helping the victims. Instead, one of the very first major projects undertaken was the construction of a brand new, state-of-the-art observatory. While people were living in temporary shelters amidst the ruins, someone decided it was absolutely critical to immediately build a complex for studying astronomical bodies. And this was not an isolated incident. In many photographs from the mid-19th century, showing landscapes devoid of mature vegetation and bearing clear traces of mudflows, observatories stand prominently, often in pristine condition. Either they were just constructed on freshly cleared ground, or they were among the very first structures to be restored after the catastrophe. Both possibilities raise the same question: why? For what conceivable reason would you invest enormous funds and labor into astronomical research during such desperate times? Was knowledge about planetary orbits and the composition of distant nebulae really more important than feeding and housing the survivors of a ruined world? The priority seems so illogical, so divorced from basic human needs, that it suggests there must have been some hidden reason for this obsession with the skies. Perhaps it wasn't about simple scientific curiosity at all. What if the people building these observatories were not merely watching the stars, but were watching for something specific? What if, having survived one global cataclysm, possibly one that came from space, they were desperately scanning the heavens, expecting it to happen again? In that context, the observatory transforms from a place of academic study into something else entirely: a strategic watchtower, an early warning system. Or perhaps they were searching the skies not for a threat, but for a sign, a signal, evidence of something or someone out there. It sounds like science fiction, but the facts remain stubborn. In a time when every resource should have gone to rebuilding earthly civilization, the heavens took priority. This phenomenon, like the empty streets and the flood traces, is another piece of a massive puzzle. And to see how all these pieces fit together, to understand what they are really telling us, we need to examine one city in particular under a microscope. It is in the smallest details, the ones that escape a casual glance, that we find the key. A key that not only confirms our darkest suspicions, but exposes a direct and deliberate forgery in the official historical timeline. Among all the enigmatic photographs of dead cities, There is a series of panoramic images from St. Petersburg that becomes the smoking gun, the piece of evidence that shatters the official story completely. These images, supposedly dated to 1861, show the familiar scene, the magnificent architecture of Palace Square, St. Isaac's Cathedral rising into the sky, the Admiralty, all of it wrapped in that same absolute ringing emptiness. No people, no carriages, no signs whatsoever of a living, breathing capital city. At first, it seems like just another example of the same inexplicable phenomenon we've been examining. But hidden in the details of these St. Petersburg panoramas is something irrefutable, something that transforms a mystery into proof of deliberate historical falsification. The evidence is in the street lamps. In the photographs that historians confidently assign to the year 1861, you can clearly see a very specific design of lighting fixture. These are not simple oil lamps. They are advanced gas or electric lamps, part of a centralized municipal lighting system. And here is where the problem arises. According to all official documents, according to historical records that anyone can verify, including sources as accessible as Wikipedia, lamps of this particular model were installed in St. Petersburg much later. Their installation on Palace Square and the surrounding streets was part of a major modernization project that was only completed in 1876. This fact is easy to check. Earlier engravings and photographs of the same locations, for example from 1856, exist, and these lamps are simply not there yet. This creates an impossible contradiction. If we believe the official date of the photograph, 1861, then we must conclude that the documented history of St. Petersburg's street lighting is wrong, that advanced technology arrived in the city a full 15 years earlier than anyone has ever acknowledged. But if we trust the documented history of when these lamps were actually installed, then the conclusion is far more disturbing. The photograph could not possibly have been taken in 1861. It was taken in 1876 or even later, and that changes everything. By 1876, photographic technology had advanced enormously. Exposure times had become much shorter. The sensitivity of photographic emulsions had improved dramatically. Photographers were routinely capturing moving objects without difficulty. There are thousands of photographs from the 1870s, from all over the world, showing busy city streets filled with people walking, horses pulling carriages, boats moving on rivers. Even if some moving figures still appeared slightly blurred, they were there, visible, filling the images with life. If the panorama of St. Petersburg was actually taken after 1876, then the excuse of technical limitations vanishes completely. The technology existed to capture people, and yet they are still absent. The city remains utterly lifeless. The alibi of primitive camera technology, which was already weak, is now completely destroyed. We are not looking at a technical artifact. We are looking at documented reality. In the capital of the Russian Empire in the late 1870s, there were no people on the central streets. This discovery forces us to confront two fundamental and deeply troubling questions. First, why would anyone deliberately falsify the dating of these images, pushing them back 15 years? What truth was this manipulation designed to conceal? And second, if the problem was not exposure time, then where did everyone actually go? What happened to this enormous city that its most central squares were completely empty in an era when technology could easily have recorded any human presence? The answers can only be speculative, but they lead us toward two possible scenarios, each one as staggering as the other, for what these mysterious photographs truly captured. The realization that the empty streets of St. Petersburg in the late 1870s were not a camera malfunction but actual reality brings our investigation to a critical turning point. All the facts we have gathered, the lifeless cities, the evidence of a global catastrophe, the strange priority given to building observatories, the proven falsification of dates, all of it demands an explanation. And at this point, two primary theories emerge, two versions, each explaining this shocking evidence in its own way, and each one overturning everything we thought we understood about the past. Both suggest a massive event that was either hidden or deliberately distorted in the official historical record. The first version we might call the progress report. According to this theory, we are not looking at cities before they were abandoned. We are looking at them in the final stages of restoration after abandonment. What we mistake for ordinary 19th century urban life is actually the moment when civilization is being rebooted. A global cataclysm, perhaps the very mudflood whose traces are so visible everywhere, destroyed or drove out the previous inhabitants of these cities. They were buried under clay and silt and sand, reduced to silent ruins. At some point afterward, new people arrived in these territories and began the massive work of excavation and restoration. The photographs, in this interpretation, would be a kind of before and after documentation, a report showing that the work has been completed. This would explain the sterile cleanliness of the streets. They have just been dug out and washed clean. It explains the absence of everyday objects and clutter. The new inhabitants have not moved in yet. It explains the abnormally young trees. They were freshly planted in the cleared areas. The cities are empty because they are ready for settlement, but not yet settled. The panoramic views show ships at anchor in harbors. Perhaps they are not delivering trade goods, but rather construction materials, furniture, food supplies, and most importantly, the new residents themselves. These new people may have been farmers or migrants from less affected regions, recruited or commanded to occupy and populate an infrastructure that was built by someone else entirely. The solitary figures appearing in some photographs are not residents. They are engineers, administrators, inspectors, or military personnel overseeing the final stages of preparation. The falsification of dates also makes perfect sense in this scenario. It was necessary to erase any memory of the catastrophe and the period of emptiness that followed, creating instead an illusion of continuous, unbroken history, where the cities had always been as they are now and had always belonged to the people who currently live in them. The second version is even more radical. We might call it the Great Erasure. This hypothesis suggests that the cities were not empty at all. On the contrary, they were full of life, but it was a kind of life that future generations were never supposed to see. Perhaps the technological level of the previous civilization was significantly higher than we are led to believe. The streets may have been filled with electric trams drawing power from some unknown source. Or perhaps horseless vehicles, early automobiles that would not fit the narrative of a primitive steam and horse era. The architecture and the details of daily life may have included elements that would contradict the carefully constructed story of a backward age. According to this version, the photographs were subjected to deliberate and meticulous retouching. Not only people, but all inconvenient technological artifacts were systematically erased from the images. It was a massive effort to sanitize the historical record. Only the neutral background was permitted to remain, the grand but ideologically safe architecture. Occasionally, to make the images appear more authentic, and to align them with the desired historical period, a few primitive horse-drawn carts might have been added, painted into the scene to symbolize the supposed technological level of the time. Faking the dates served to reinforce the desired version of history. The goal of this global deception was to hide the truth about the actual level of development achieved by the civilization that came before, and quite possibly to hide the reasons for its disappearance. These two versions, different as they are, converge on one fundamental and unavoidable conclusion. The people we occasionally see in the rare lively photographs of that era, dressed in peasant clothing, traveling on primitive carts, simply could not have been the builders of these magnificent cities. The scale and complexity of the architecture, the precision of the stonework, the engineering solutions visible in structures like St. Isaac's Cathedral or the Alexander Column, all of it stands in glaring contradiction to the level of technological development that official history attributes to them. Which brings us to the final and most important question. If they did not build these cities, then who did? Both theories, the Progress Report and the Great Erasure, lead us inevitably to the same staggering conclusion. The magnificent cities captured in 19th century photographs were not constructed by the people in rough clothing and simple carts that official history presents to us. The gap between their supposed technological capabilities and the reality frozen in granite and marble is far too vast to be explained away. You only need to look at the structures still standing in the center of Saint Petersburg and other great capitals to understand that we are dealing with the legacy of an entirely different, far more powerful and technologically advanced civilization. Consider St. Isaac's Cathedral. Its granite columns are not simply architectural features, they are megaliths. Each one is carved from a single, solid piece of granite, weighs approximately 110 tons, and is polished to an almost mirror-like perfection. Official history expects us to believe that these monoliths were quarried in Karelia, transported hundreds of kilometers by water, and then lifted into position and installed with absolute precision using nothing more than primitive wooden scaffolding and peasant ingenuity. Even today, with modern steel cranes and powerful trucks, executing such a project would be an enormously complex engineering challenge. To accept that it was done in the early bustle 19th century with the methods described requires suspending all disbelief. But the columns of St. Isaac's Cathedral are nothing compared to the Alexander Column in Palace Square. This is no longer simply a megalith. It is an engineering miracle, a single piece of red granite standing nearly 50 meters tall and weighing over 600 tons. It is not buried in the ground. It is not anchored by anything except its own colossal mass. Raising such an object to a vertical position is a task that defies comprehension. The technology required to quarry it, shape it, transport it, and erect it must have been orders of magnitude more advanced than anything we are told existed in that era. This is the work of a civilization that understood how to manipulate stone in ways that we, even with our modern metals and machines, cannot replicate. And there are countless other examples. Near the capital, in Pavlovsk Park, sits the so-called Tsar's Bath, a perfectly carved bowl made from a single piece of granite, over 5 meters in diameter and weighing 48 tons. The technology used to create it is completely lost to us. All of these artifacts are silent witnesses, screaming at us that the official story of how these cities were built is a fabrication. But it is not just about the technology. The symbolism decorating these monuments also raises serious questions and points toward the global, rather than local, nature of this vanished civilization. The Alexander Column, for instance, is decorated not with traditional Russian double-headed eagles, but with Hessian eagles, typical of Western European heraldry. And on its reliefs, you can find an even stranger symbol, the all-seeing eye enclosed within a pyramid. This Masonic or esoteric emblem has no place in the official Orthodox Christian culture of the Russian Empire at that time. How did it end up in the very heart of the capital? This symbolism suggests the existence of a unified global elite or culture that ruled the world before the supposed catastrophe, leaving its signature on key monuments across the entire planet. The empty cities are just the visible tip of the iceberg. Beneath them lies the secret of a lost, highly advanced civilization. We might call it an empire of titans. Not necessarily giants in physical stature, though perhaps that as well, but certainly giants in terms of the scale of their achievements and their capabilities. They left us their cities as an inheritance, but their history was erased, replaced by a convenient and oversimplified myth about primitive peoples who somehow built it all with their bare hands. This conclusion, which started with a simple question about empty photographs, seems almost impossible to accept. And yet, there may be other evidence, even more direct and even more shocking, still locked away under the highest classification in secret archives, waiting for its moment to be revealed. Our journey, which began with old faded photographs, has brought us to the threshold of an entirely different reality, one that exists behind the carefully polished surface of official history. The mysterious images of deserted 19th century cities are no longer just a technical oddity or a historical curiosity. They have become crucial pieces of evidence in a vast investigation, pointing toward events of truly planetary significance. These are not simply pictures of the past. They are quite possibly silent witnesses to a global catastrophe that erased an entire civilization from existence, followed by a carefully orchestrated reboot of history carried out by whoever came afterward. We started with one straightforward question: where did all the people go? Step by step, by eliminating convenient but ultimately flawed explanations, we have arrived at conclusions that many will find shocking. We demonstrated that the myth of long camera exposures does not survive contact with facts and logic. We discovered unmistakable traces of a worldwide cataclysm, layers of clay and sediment that washed away an old world, leaving behind only the clean stone skeletons of cities. We encountered the inexplicable priorities of the survivors, or perhaps of those who arrived on these lands afterward, who made building observatories their first task, as if they were desperately scanning the skies for either a threat or a signal. Finally, using Saint Petersburg as our case study, we caught the forgers in the act, proving that the dates assigned to the photographs were deliberately falsified to conceal a massive gap in the timeline. All of these threads weave together into a single tapestry. They reveal a world that has survived an apocalypse, And the megalithic structures, monuments like St. Isaac's Cathedral and the Alexander Column, stand as irrefutable proof that the civilization which came before possessed technologies we are only beginning to understand even today. Those who are presented to us as the builders of these empires were most likely nothing more than inheritors, people who moved into ready-made cities and were subsequently given a rewritten history to explain their presence there. What we have examined here is merely a beginning, a glimpse through the keyhole into a world that is deliberately hidden from us. This conclusion may sound like fantasy, but it rests on facts and logic, not blind faith. And this is only the start. If we could pull back the curtain of secrecy just a little bit further, we would find even more direct and astonishing evidence. There are classified archives, including those held by intelligence agencies, that contain information never intended for public consumption. Within those top-secret files are reports of archaeological discoveries that do not fit into the mainstream scientific narrative. We are talking about findings of skeletal remains belonging to beings 6 to 11 meters tall. Documented sightings of unidentified flying objects, the results of mysterious expeditions like Admiral Richard Byrd's journey to Antarctica, the technological mysteries explored by powers during the Second World War. There are even entire research projects dedicated to studying alternative cosmological models, containing scientific arguments for ideas that seem absurd within the mainstream framework. The world is far more complex and far stranger than what we are taught in school. The main purpose of investigations like this one is not to provide ready-made answers. It is to ask the right questions, to encourage everyone not to simply accept any version of events at face value, whether that version is official or alternative, to urge you to think critically, to compare facts, to look for contradictions, to seek out primary sources and examine them for yourself. History is not a frozen monument carved in stone. It is a battlefield where different forces fight for the right to control our perception of the past, and therefore our understanding of the future. Explore the world that exists behind the official narrative, and you may discover a reality that surpasses the wildest imagination. True knowledge has always been waiting for those willing to search for it.